Hi, I'm Amanda Jane Woodall and welcome to my fashion school. So today we're going to be taking a look at British subculture, exploring UK punk and the history of punk style, where we ask the questions: who created punk style? What did punks wear? And how did punk start? And to kick things off, we're going to take a look at the history of punk band the Sex Pistols. So we transport back to 1970s Britain, where we are met with upheaval, disillusioned working class, and a strike on all amenities. You couldn't even watch the TV without it switching on and off, and people were really starting to get fed up with the way the country was run. A misfit group of London teenage lads would hang around at a clothing boutique where their friend Glenn Matlock had a Saturday job selling very unique clothing. Steve Jones was the bad boy of the group and he felt really unwanted at home. He had a bad family life and a very abusive stepfather. So he spent his time stealing, drinking and chatting up women. The cook lived just round the corner from Steve and he had very kind parents and he had an apprenticeship as an electrician, but he was still set to lead a very modest and boring lifestyle. And Glenn Matlock was a slightly nicer chap. He was very artistic and he was into classic rock and roll. And it is said that he had the most skill as a musician in the band. The fourth member of the group was WALLY Nightingale, and he actually came up with the idea for the band when he decided, let's just play the instruments that Steve had been stealing from the Hammersmith Odeon. So kind of half-heartedly they formed this group, and the band had many names, most of which I can't say on YouTube. Now, the owners of the boutique were Vivienne Westwood and Malcolm McLaren, a hard-working, rebellious single mother and a high-class, narcissistic dreamer. And Steve kind of became friends with McLaren, who really latched on to Steve's poor street urchin appeal. It was a bit like a subversive Fagin Artful Dodger scenario. And Malcolm actually had some music industry contacts because he had previously managed the junkie band, the New York Dolls, and he agreed to manage Steve's band on the condition that they sacked WALLY Nightingale because he didn't like his glasses and he thought he was a bit of a square. Meanwhile, a North London group of friends, all called John, started frequenting the boutique. And the boutique had changed its image. They used to sell very unique teddy boy clothing, but they changed to adult wear and leather because McLaren was getting threatened by the teddy boys. And one of these Johns was John Lydon, who later became known as Johnny Rotten due to his bad teeth and poor dental hygiene. John had been a really sick child. He had meningitis, which caused amnesia, and he was very shy and overlooked as a child until he started learning about the injustices of the world, and this spurred him on to become a rebel by the age of 14. And John attended the boutique because he wanted to buy the bizarre, distressed and kind of anti-political clothing that they were selling so that he could stand out amongst his peers. He felt a particular hatred towards the authorities and the out-of-date systems running the country into filth. So he wanted to dress like trash so that he was being really honest about the reality of the strikes, which included London being littered with rubbish. And when McLaren saw John, he thought he looked perfect to be the lead singer of his new band, which he had now named the Sex Pistols because he thought they were the Exy assassins leading the rebellion. And John auditioned for the band singing Alice Cooper 18, and he had a very disjointed, gnarled, hunched way of moving and an out of tune, leering voice that really transformed the sound of the band. And his kind of wild style was adopted by the rest of the band, but also the fans of the Sex Pistols, who saw Johnny Rotten as an anti-establishment hero. The style of punk reflected poverty, do-it-yourself and grime. Clothes were ripped, second-hand and held together with safety pins, or holes were made really big to make a statement. It was visually the opposite of the early 70s style of dress, which was flares and platforms and perfectly coiffed hair. Early punks were expressive, unique, androgynous teenagers who just wore whatever they could afford. They wrote slogans of defiance on old shirts, and they made no effort to dress up the fact that they couldn't afford the newest fashions. And hair was messy, spiky or buzz cut or a mixture of three. They had bad hair dye jobs and piercings to add kind of individuality. And later, punk style evolved into what is known as postcard punk, which sees the sad decline of punk into the mainstream. And the people following this version of punk bought leather jackets, chains, studs, fishnets and had big mohawks, and this is kind of like very cliche version of punk, and it doesn't say much about the individual or empowerment. And Glenn had become an art student, and he got the band their very first gig at Central St Martin's, where they performed cover songs in front of the art students. And this was a light bulb moment for the band when they collectively realised that they all thrived off the energy, the atmosphere of this kind of intoxicated, screaming musical experience. But the band encountered many difficulties due to a kind of clash between all the broken personalities of the group, and they didn't have very much skill musically. They had to work really hard to make a cohesive sound. And after quite a lot of failure, Glenn finally came up with some music for the instruments. And following this, Johnny was inspired to write lyrics about how he saw London at that time. And Johnny's first lyrics were, "I am an antichrist," which formed the basis of the song Anarchy in the UK, which is now considered punk genius. And they had to threaten McLaren to promote the band. And eventually they started touring the UK with kind of varying degrees of success because they sounded bad, they had horrible temperaments, and they were really weird for the time. So they were kind of met with a lot of aggression, violence, and kind of spitting, fighting, and throwing became hallmarks of all their gigs. But every place that they toured, they kind of picked up a few more fans, which started to build up into a fan base that followed them around the country. And some early fans of the Sex Pistols are Susie Sue, Billy Idol and Shane MacGowan, who also went on to be alternative music stars. So through the kind of wild behaviour, the antics and word of mouth, the mainstream media started to get interested in punk, and they were invited onto the Today Show with Bill Grundy. And it didn't go very well, it was very chaotic, and some members of the band ended up swearing live on British TV, which was a big taboo for the time, and so they were held as the villains of British polite society. And behind the scenes, the band were signing many dodgy record deals kind of curated by Malcolm McLaren, and they were earning no money. They got £20 a week for being the voice and the face of a generation. But on the positive side, the band had given hope to a bunch of teenage degenerates who saw that it didn't matter what you looked like, there was beauty in anything, and even if you didn't have any talent, you could still make something of yourself. And one of these fans was John Simon Ritchie, who was said to be the band's superfan. John went to all the band's gigs and he was responsible for creating excitement in the audience. He invented the pogo, which was a state of jumping up and down, kind of throwing yourself into everyone, and it caused a lot of fights between rival punks at the concerts. And John Simon Ritchie would soon be known as Sid Vicious. He was named after Johnny Rotten's hamster who bit him when he was trying to be kind to it. And he lived up to the name Sid Vicious. He attacked a music journalist, Nick Kent, with a metal chain. You see, Sid was very disturbed, he was wild, he was reckless because he had a really unfortunate home life. He had taken substances from a young age because his mother was a dealer. And at this point, tensions had reached boiling point within the band, and Glenn got the sack. And Sid seemed like the most natural replacement as he really embodied the spirit of punk. As a publicity stunt to boost the sales of their new single, God Save the Queen, they played this national anthem of theirs on the Thames at the Queen's Silver Jubilee. And British people are pretty loyal to the Queen, so this didn't go down very well and they got violently attacked. Two of the members, Paul and John, both were stabbed. But their album reached platinum sales and it debuted at #1 in October 1977. And God Save the Queen actually reached the top spot but was banned from being announced as a British #1. And so the band, they couldn't go anywhere without being attacked. So they had to start living closeted and boring lifestyles. And this just caused so much resentment, frustration, boredom and anger between the members. They had a final tour of America where the band finally split, and Malcolm McLaren had his hand in it. He had really played off the two groups of friends. So you had Paul and Steve against Johnny and Sid. McLaren was a self-confessed narcissist. He only saw the band members as materials to paint his art with. So he really didn't care about the emotional effects on the band. And Sid had entered into a really toxic relationship with a former stripper and groupie, Nancy Spungen. And it took a really tragic turn because Nancy was found passed away in a hotel room in New York on the 11th of October 1978. And Sid faced 15 years in jail for the crime of stabbing her. But he never got to stand trial because he actually lost his life to an overdose in February of 1979. And the rest of the band members have expressed their deep regret and sorrow for the tragic end of the punk movement. The short-lived punk era is seen as absolutely pivotal part of British fashion history and has been adopted by the majority of high-end designers. It inspired the goth subculture and also led to the creation of many music-based fashion styles, and it's very unlikely that it would be repeated with any kind of impact because punk was very reflective of the time period that it lived in. However, the legacy of punk is that it taught us things that are really valuable and vital in the modern fashion industry. The fashion industry is outdated and it needs reforming, and we need to look at new ways of DIY, reinvention, and changing the process of clothing to make it sustainable. So we have come to the end of this video, but I will see you again in my follow-up video where we're looking at punk again, and we're going to look at the queen of rebel fashion. A hardworking, rebellious single mom and a